Sleep Spell presents The Cosmere, a complete introduction. Act 1, The Universe Behind the Stories. Welcome to the Cosmere. Welcome. Before we dive into magic systems, epic battles, and legendary heroes, we need to talk about something bigger. Something that connects dozens of books, hundreds of characters, and entire worlds. If you've picked up a Brandon Sanderson book, you might have noticed something. References that don't quite fit. Characters showing up in different worlds. Magic systems that feel connected somehow. That's because you're not just reading a book. You're reading part of the Cosmere. And today, we're going to explain everything. What the Cosmere is, how it works, why it matters, and how all these stories connect. This is going to be comprehensive. We're starting from the absolute beginning, assuming you know nothing. By the end, you'll understand the hidden universe that ties together some of the most creative fantasy ever written. So settle in. Whether you're here to learn or to fall asleep to deep fantasy lore, you're in the right place. This is the complete guide to the Cosmere. What is the Cosmere? Let's start with the most basic question. What is the Cosmere? At its simplest, the Cosmere is a universe, not a planet, not a solar system, but an entire dwarf galaxy filled with different planetary systems, each with its own worlds, its own societies, and its own stories. Brandon Sanderson, the author, has created this setting as the stage for most of his fantasy novels. Books like Mistborn, the Stormlight Archive, Warbreaker, and Elantris all take place in the Cosmere. They're set on different planets, separated by vast distances of space, but they're all part of the same universe, with the same underlying rules. Now here's what makes this interesting. These aren't just books that happen to share a universe in some vague way. The Cosmere has consistent rules. The magic systems, while appearing very different on each world, all stem from the same fundamental source. There are characters who can travel between these worlds. Events on one planet can have subtle effects on another. And there's an overarching story being told across all these books. A story about gods, power, and the fate of entire civilizations. Think of it like this. If you've seen the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where Iron Man, Thor, and the Guardians of the Galaxy all exist in the same universe and occasionally cross over, the Cosmere works similarly. Except instead of superheroes, you have epic fantasy worlds. Instead of movies, you have massive novels. And instead of post-credit scenes, you have subtle clues and references woven into the text. But here's the brilliant part. You don't need to know any of this to enjoy a Cosmere book. You can read Mistborn and love it without knowing anything about the Cosmere. You can read The Way of Kings and be completely satisfied without recognizing the Worldhoppers. Sanderson writes each series to stand alone. But if you do know about the Cosmere, if you understand the connections, there's a whole other level of enjoyment. You start seeing the patterns. You recognize the subtle references. You understand the bigger picture. And that's what we're here to explore. Why Sanderson created the Cosmere.
Before we dig into how the Cosmere works, let's talk about why it exists. Brandon Sanderson started writing the Cosmere early in his career. He had this idea that he wanted to tell an epic story across multiple worlds, but he wanted each story to be complete and satisfying on its own. He didn't want to write a traditional series where you have to read Book 1 to understand Book 2. He wanted to write different stories, different genres even, all connected by deeper lore. Sanderson has explained in interviews that he was inspired by authors like Anne McCaffrey and her Pern series, where different books explored different aspects of the same world. He also drew inspiration from comic book universes, where different heroes have their own books, but occasionally cross over. But Sanderson wanted to do something different. He wanted to create fantasy worlds that felt unique and separate, where readers could enjoy them individually, but where dedicated fans could discover the connections. He also wanted to explore a specific set of ideas about power, divinity, and magic. In the Cosmere, gods are not eternal, unchanging beings. They're entities with personalities, flaws, and agendas. Magic is not mysterious force. It's a system with rules that can be studied and understood. And power always comes with a cost. These themes run through every Cosmere book, but they're expressed differently on each world. By creating a shared universe, Sanderson could explore these ideas from multiple angles while telling wildly different stories. The scope of the Cosmere. Let's talk about scale. As of 2025, Sanderson has published multiple series and standalone novels set in the Cosmere. The Mistborn series, which includes 2 complete trilogies and a 4th era in progress. The Stormlight Archive, which is planned as 2 5-book series with 4 books published so far. In the first series, Warbreaker, a standalone novel, Elantris, another standalone with a sequel planned. The Emperor's Soul, a novella. White Sand, a graphic novel series, and several shorter works and novellas. That's already a massive amount of content. But Sanderson has stated that he has decades of Cosmere stories planned. He knows how the overarching story ends. He has outlines for series that take place on planets we haven't even visited yet. He's playing a very long game. The current published works represent maybe a third of what he has planned. Some series are set in the past of the Cosmere, some in the present, and some will be set in the future. There are medieval fantasy worlds, Renaissance-era worlds, and worlds with technology comparable to the early 1900s. Eventually, Sanderson plans to write science fiction books set in the Cosmere, when the various planets have discovered space travel and are interacting directly. But that's decades away in real time, and far in the future of the in-universe timeline. For now, we're in the era where the planets are mostly isolated, where space travel is extremely rare and difficult, and where only a handful of characters even know that other worlds exist. Understanding Cosmere chronology. One important thing to understand about the Cosmere is the different times. This isn't like reading a traditional series where Book 1 happens before Book 2. In the Cosmere, an entire trilogy on one world might take place before, during, or after books on another world. The chronology is complex. The furthest back in the timeline are the events that created the Cosmere as we know it. The Shattering of Adonalsium, which we'll discuss in detail later. This happened thousands of years before any of the main series. Then you have Elantris and Warbreaker, which are set relatively early in the Cosmere timeline, a few hundred years after the Shattering. The Stormlight Archive is set later, roughly 1,000 years after the Shattering, though the exact timeline is complex because of the way time works on different planets. The original Mistborn trilogy is set around the same time as Stormlight, give or take. The Mistborn Era 2 series, the Wax and Wane books, are set about 300 years after the original trilogy. And future Mistborn books will be set even further in the future, during the space age of the Cosmere. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because of the way time and space work in the Cosmere, characters can world hop, traveling from one planet to another. But time passes differently on different worlds depending on where they are in the spiritual realm, and other factors we'll discuss. So a world hopper could leave planet A, travel to planet B, spend a year there and return to planet A to find that 5 years have passed. This creates a complex web of cause and effect across the Cosmere. Events in one series can influence events in another series, even if those series seem to be happening at the same time. And some characters, the ones who can world hop and who have extended lifespans through various means, show up in multiple series across different time periods. Tracking all of this is part of the fun for dedicated fans. Sanderson leaves clues, and readers piece together the chronology like a puzzle. The realms: physical, cognitive, and spiritual. Now we need to talk about the fundamental structure of reality in the Cosmere. This is crucial for understanding how everything works. In the Cosmere, reality is divided into 3 realms: the physical realm, the cognitive realm, and the spiritual realm. Every object, every person, every bit of matter exists in all 3 realms simultaneously, but in different forms. Let's start with the physical realm. This is what most people think of as reality. It's the material world. Planets, stars, people's bodies, rocks, water, everything you can touch and see. The physical realm is the realm of matter and energy, of cause and effect, of time and space as we normally understand them. When characters in Cosmere books go about their daily lives, they're interacting with the physical realm. This is the realm that most people on most planets don't even realize is just one of 3 layers of reality. Then there's the cognitive realm. This is the realm of thought, of perception, of how things are understood and defined. In the cognitive realm, every object and person has a presence based on how they perceive themselves and how others perceive them. A person in the cognitive realm appears as they see themselves, not necessarily as their physical body looks. A building in the cognitive realm appears based on how it's thought of, how significant it is. The cognitive realm is also where distance works differently. In the physical realm, the space between planets is vast and impossible to cross without technology. But in the cognitive realm, the distance between worlds is much smaller. If you know how to access the cognitive realm, you can use it to travel from one planet to another without actually flying through space. This is how world hoppers move between planets. They shift into the cognitive realm, travel the much shorter distance there, and shift back into the physical realm on another world. There are dangers to this, of course. The cognitive realm has its own inhabitants and its own threats, but it's the key to interplanetary travel in the current era of the Cosmere.
Finally, there's the spiritual realm. This is the hardest realm to understand because it doesn't work like the other two. The spiritual realm is the realm of connections, of possibility, of the fundamental truths that underlie reality. In the spiritual realm, there is no time and no distance. Everything is connected to everything else. Every possible state an object could be in exists in the spiritual realm. When someone uses healing magic in the Cosmere, they're often accessing the spiritual realm to see what a person's ideal, uninjured state should be, and then using Investiture, magical power, to restore the physical body to match that ideal. The spiritual realm is also where Shards and their power primarily exist, which we'll get to. Most people can't consciously access the spiritual realm. They can't perceive it or interact with it directly. But it's always there, underlying everything, connecting all things across time and space. Some rare individuals, through magic or other means, can touch the spiritual realm and use that connection for various purposes. Understanding these three realms is essential to understanding Cosmere magic. Different magic systems interact with different realms in different ways. Some systems pull power from the spiritual realm and manifest it in the physical. Some systems use the cognitive realm to connect minds or alter perceptions. Some systems interact with all three realms simultaneously. The three realms are the framework on which all of Cosmere reality is built. They're always there, always interacting, even when characters don't realize it. Investiture, the fundamental magic. Now that we understand the Investiture is the fundamental magical energy of the Cosmere. It's what powers all magic systems on all worlds. Think of Investiture as the universal magical currency. Every magic system in the Cosmere uses Investiture, but they access it in different ways, shape it in different ways, and produce different effects. On Scadrial, the world of Mistborn, Investiture takes the form of metals that allomancers burn to fuel their powers. On Roshar, the world of the Stormlight Archive, Investiture exists as Stormlight, a glowing energy that can be stored and used. On Nalthis, the world of Warbreaker, Investiture is called Breath, and can be transferred from person to person. These all seem like completely different magic systems. And they are, in terms of how they work and what they can do. But underneath, they're all using the same fundamental force, Investiture, just accessed and applied differently. Investiture comes from Shards, which we'll discuss in detail soon. But the basic idea is that Shards are godlike entities who hold vast amounts of Investiture, that Investiture seeps into the planets where Shards have invested themselves, and it manifests in ways influenced by the Shards' intent and the planet's spiritual characteristics. Different planets have different amounts of Investiture. Different planets have Investiture manifesting in different forms, but it's all the same underlying energy. And people who understand this, who study Investiture as a science rather than treating magic as mysterious and unknowable, can potentially learn to use multiple forms of Investiture. They might learn Allomancy on Scadrial,
and then travel to Roshar and learn to use Stormlight. The techniques are different, but the underlying principles are consistent.
Investiture follows rules. This is important. In the Cosmere, magic is not random or unpredictable. It's a science. It can be studied, experimented with, and understood. Sanderson calls this his first law of magic, that an author's ability to resolve conflicts with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands that magic. And in the Cosmere, we get to understand magic very well, because it has consistent, logical rules. First rule of Investiture: it cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. This is similar to the conservation of energy in physics. When an Allomancer burns metal, they're not creating power from nothing. They're accessing Investiture through the metal and transforming it into kinetic energy, heat, or other effects. The metal itself isn't magic. It's a key that unlocks access to Investiture. Second rule: Investiture always comes from somewhere. Nothing is free. Different magic systems have different costs. In Allomancy, the cost is the metal. In Roshar, the cost is Stormlight, which must be renewed. In Nalthis, the cost is breath, pieces of a person's life force. You can't get something for nothing. Third rule: Investiture is affected by identity, connection, and intent. These are spiritual attributes. Identity is who you are at a fundamental level. Connection is your relationships and ties to places, people, and things. Intent is what you mean to do, what you're trying to accomplish. A person's identity determines which forms of investiture they can naturally access. Their connections influence how investiture flows to and from them. Their intent shapes what investiture does when they use it. These rules apply everywhere in the Cosmere. They're the physics of magic, and they're consistent across all worlds. Understanding them is key to understanding how Cosmere magic works. Adonalsium and the Shattering. Now we come to the single most important event in Cosmere history, the Shattering of Adonalsium. This is the creation story of the Cosmere as we know it. It's ancient history, thousands of years before any of the main series, but its consequences shape everything. Adonalsium was a god, the god, capital G, a singular divine entity of immense power that existed before anything else. We don't know much about what Adonalsium was like. Was it good? Evil? Indifferent? Sanderson hasn't revealed that yet. What we do know is that Adonalsium was a being of such vast power that it essentially was the Cosmere, or at least the most powerful thing in it. Adonalsium held all the investiture in the universe, all of it. Every bit of magical power that exists on every world came from Adonalsium originally. And at some point, thousands of years ago, Adonalsium was killed, deliberately, by a group of individuals who had their reasons for wanting the god dead. We don't know exactly who these people were or why they did it. Sanderson has hinted that we'll learn more about this as the Cosmere story progresses, particularly in the later Stormlight books, and in a planned series called Dragonsteel. What we do know is that the group who killed Adonalsium, sometimes called the 16 because there were 16 of them,
used some kind of weapon or technique to shatter the god. And when Adonalsium died, its power didn't just dissipate. It broke into 16 pieces, 16 shards of Adonalsium, each one a fragment of the original god's power and consciousness. Here's where it gets interesting. Each of the 16 people who participated in the Shattering took up one of these shards. They became vessels, bonding with this divine power and becoming gods themselves. But these weren't blank slates of power. Each shard had an intent, a fundamental nature or purpose that defined it. Shards like preservation, ruin, honor, cultivation, devotion, dominion, endowment, odium, and others. 16 shards, each with a different intent, each taken up by a different person who then became the vessel of that shard. The person who took up preservation became the god of preserving things, of stability and protection. The person who took up ruin became the god of entropy and change, and so on. The vessel's original personality and the shard's intent merged, creating something new. Sometimes the vessel could maintain their sense of self and direct the shard's power. Sometimes the intent overwhelmed the vessel, and they became more of an embodiment of the shard than a person. These 16 shards, these new gods, spread out across the Cosmere. They went to different planets. Some shards worked together, investing in the same worlds. Others went alone, and they began to shape the planets they invested in. Where a shard invests itself, pouring its investiture into a planet, magic begins to manifest. The type of magic, the way it works, is influenced by the shard's intent. On Scadrial, preservation and ruin both invested, and the magic systems there reflect both aspects. On Roshar, honor and cultivation invested, and the magic systems there are about oaths and growth. On Nalthis, endowment invested, and the magic is about giving and taking life force. The shattering of Adonalsium is the reason different planets have different magic. It's the reason gods exist in the Cosmere, and it's the beginning of the cosmic-level conflict that runs through all the series. Because the shards, despite all being fragments of the same original being, don't get along. Some shards have complementary intents and work together. Others have opposing intents and fight. And one shard in particular, Odium, actively seeks to destroy the other shards and claim their power for itself. The 16 shards.
Let's talk about the shards individually. We don't know all the details about every shard yet because Sanderson is revealing information gradually across multiple books. But here's what we know so far. First, preservation and ruin. These shards invested in Scadrial, the world of Mistborn. Preservation's intent is to preserve things, to keep things as they are, to protect and maintain. Ruin's intent is to break things down, to bring about endings, to allow change through destruction. These intents are opposed but complementary. You need both to have a functioning world. Preservation alone would cause stagnation. Ruin alone would cause total annihilation. Together, they created a world where things can exist and change, where civilizations can rise and fall, where there's a balance. The vessels of these shards were Lyras for preservation and Ati for ruin. Their conflict and eventual resolution
are central to the Mistborn series. Next, honor and cultivation. These shards invested in Roshar, the world of the Stormlight Archive. Honor's intent is about oaths, bonds, and keeping your word. Honor values law, order, and righteousness. Cultivation's intent is about growth, change, and nurturing potential. Cultivation helps things evolve and become greater versions of themselves. Together on Roshar, they created a world where power comes from bonds and oaths, where magic is tied to personal growth and keeping promises. The vessel of honor was Tanavast, who plays a significant role in Rosharan history. The vessel of cultivation is still active, still present, and still influencing events, though in subtle ways. Then there's odium. Odium's intent is the most dangerous of all the shards we've encountered. Odium is not hatred exactly, though that's close. Odium is passion, divorced from conscience. It's the divine embodiment of powerful emotion without restraint or moral consideration. Odium is rage, lust, joy, all emotions at their most extreme and uncontrolled. The vessel of odium was Ray's, and odium is a major antagonist in the Stormlight Archive. Unlike other shards that invested in planets and helped shape them, odium has been traveling the Cosmere, systematically killing other shards and claiming their power. Odium has already destroyed multiple shards that we know of, and it seeks to eventually become the dominant power in the Cosmere. Devotion and dominion, invested in Sel, the world of Elantris. Devotion's intent is about religious devotion, service, and selfless dedication. Dominion's intent is about control, ruling, and exerting power over others. On Sel, their combined influence created magic systems tied to geography and language, systems that require knowledge and careful application. But here's the tragic part. Odium came to Sel and killed both devotion and dominion. The vessels of these shards, Aeona and Sky, were destroyed. Their power was splintered, broken into countless pieces and stuffed into Sel's cognitive realm, which created all sorts of problems for that planet. This is why magic on Sel is so different from magic on other worlds. The shards were murdered, and their power was deliberately sabotaged. Endowment invested in Nalthis, the world of Warbreaker. Endowment's intent is about giving, about granting gifts and blessings. On Nalthis, magic takes the form of breath, which can be given from one person to another. People are born with one breath, and they can accumulate more by receiving breath from others who voluntarily give it up. The more breaths you have, the more power you have. Endowment is still active and still involved in Nalthis's affairs, though in mysterious ways. There are other shards we know less about. Autonomy, whose intent is about independence and self-determination, has manifested on multiple planets in different forms. Whimsy, whose intent is unclear, but probably involves spontaneity or capriciousness. Invention, which might be on a planet we haven't seen yet. Mercy, valor, and others that have been mentioned but not explored. Sanderson has confirmed that all 16 shards exist somewhere in the Cosmere, but we've only seen a handful of them in detail so far. And here's the key thing to understand. The shards are not omnipotent. They're incredibly powerful, yes. They're gods by most definitions, but they have limitations. They're bound by their intents. A shard can't act against its fundamental nature. Preservation can't destroy. Ruin can't create. They're also bound to the planets they've invested in, making it difficult for them to leave. And they can be killed. Vessels can be destroyed, and if the vessel dies, the shard's power is released or transferred. The conflict between shards, the struggle for power, the consequences of their intense clashing. This is the backdrop against which all Cosmere stories play out. The splintering of shards. We need to talk about what happens when a shard is destroyed, because this is important for several Cosmere stories. When a shard is killed, the process is called splintering. The vessel dies, and the vast investiture that made up the shard breaks into countless fragments, called splinters. These splinters are still pieces of divine power, but they're much smaller and less coherent than a full shard. Sometimes splinters develop a level of consciousness and agency. Sometimes they're just raw power waiting to be used. On Cell, after Odium killed Devotion and Dominion, their investiture was splintered and trapped in the cognitive realm. This created the Door, a massive chaotic pool of investiture that fuels the magic systems on Cell, but is also highly dangerous and difficult to use. The magic systems on Cell, like Aeon Door from Elantris, are essentially hacks that allow people to tap into this splintered power in controlled ways. On Roshar, Honor was killed and splintered. The splinters of Honor became Spren, the spirits and beings that Radiants bond with to gain powers. When someone forms a Nahel bond with a Spren, they're essentially bonding with a tiny fragment of Honor's divine power. This is why Radiant powers feel different from other magic systems. They're not accessing a living shard. They're using pieces of a dead god. Understanding the concept of splintering helps explain why magic works differently on different planets. When a shard is alive and invested in a planet, the magic is coherent and follows patterns set by the shard's intent. When a shard is splintered, the magic becomes fragmented, sometimes more powerful in specific ways, but less stable and harder to control. Realmatic theory and the scholars. Within the Cosmere, on different worlds, there are scholars and researchers who study investiture and the realms. They don't call it Cosmere magic, obviously, because they live in this universe, and to them it's just reality. But they've developed something called Realmatic theory, which is essentially the physics of magic. Realmatic theory attempts to explain how the three realms interact, how investiture flows between them, and how magic systems work. Different scholars on different planets have discovered different pieces of this puzzle. Some have figured out that there are three realms. Some have theorized about investiture as a universal energy. Some have even discovered the existence of other planets, though they don't have the means to visit them. The most advanced Realmatic scholars are Worldhoppers, people who have traveled between planets and compared notes. They've realized that magic on different worlds has underlying similarities. They've begun to develop a unified theory of investiture. There's a group called the 17th Shard, an organization of Worldhoppers who believe that Shards shouldn't interfere with mortal affairs, and who work to minimize that interference. They're not villains exactly, but they have strong opinions about how the Cosmere should function. There are also individual scholars like Chris, who study Realmatic theory and have written essays about the different planets and their magic systems. These essays appear in some Cosmere books as appendices. They're written from an in-universe perspective and provide scholarly analysis of magic systems. The existence of these scholars and their theories is important because it shows that Cosmere magic is knowable. It's not mysterious or divine in the traditional fantasy sense. It's a science that can be studied and understood. And as the Cosmere timeline progresses, as technology advances and space travel becomes possible, this knowledge will become crucial.
Worldhoppers and perpendicularity. We've mentioned Worldhoppers several times, so let's explain what they are and how they do what they do. Worldhoppers are individuals who have discovered how to travel from one planet to another. In the current era of the Cosmere, this is extremely rare and difficult. You can't just build a spaceship and fly between planets. The distances in the physical realm are too vast. But remember the cognitive realm, where distance works differently. That's the key. To worldhop, you need to shift from the physical realm into the cognitive realm. This is not easy. Most people can't do it at all. It requires either natural ability, magical intervention, or being at a specific location called a perpendicularity. A perpendicularity is a place where the three realms are thin, where the barriers between them are weak enough to cross. Perpendicularities are usually associated with shards. When a shard invests heavily in a location, that investment creates a perpendicularity, a kind of tear in reality where you can step from one realm to another. On Scadrial, there are perpendicularities at the pits of Hathsin and at other locations tied to preservation and ruin. On Roshar, the high storms create temporary perpendicularities. On Nalthis, there's a perpendicularity tied to endowment. If you can reach a perpendicularity, you can shift into the cognitive realm. Then you need to navigate the cognitive realm, which has its own rules and dangers. The cognitive realm is populated by beings called cognitive shadows, by Spren on some worlds, and by other strange entities. Distance in the cognitive realm is based on perception and cognitive significance rather than physical distance, which makes it shorter between planets. Once you've traveled the distance in the cognitive realm, you need to find another perpendicularity, or another way to shift back into the physical realm on your destination planet. This is the basic process of world hopping. But there's a catch. To world hop successfully, you need investiture. A lot of it. Your physical body needs to be sustained by investiture to survive the transition and the journey through the cognitive realm. Most world hoppers have found ways to invest themselves, to hold investiture in their bodies permanently. Some have become radiants on Roshar. Some hold large amounts of breath from Nalthis. Some have access to other forms of investiture that keep them anchored and alive. Without sufficient investiture, attempting to world hop will kill you. Your physical form won't survive in the cognitive realm. So world hoppers are, almost by definition, people with significant magical power or access to magical resources. They're rare. They're usually well informed about the Cosmere, and they often have their own agendas.
Some Worldhoppers appear in multiple Cosmere books. Hoid, also called Wit, is the most famous. He shows up in every Cosmere novel, always in different roles, always manipulating events from the background. He's been alive since before the Shattering, and has his own mysterious goals. Other Worldhoppers include members of the 17th Shard, various merchants and travelers, and individuals seeking knowledge or power from different worlds. Recognizing Worldhoppers is part of the fun for dedicated Cosmere readers. Sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're incredibly subtle, but they're always there, moving between stories, connecting the different series. Hemalurgy, the most dangerous magic. Before we move on from discussing fundamental Cosmere mechanics, we need to talk about Hemalurgy. This is one of the three metallic arts from Scadrial, alongside Allomancy and Feruchemy, but unlike those systems, Hemalurgy works everywhere in the Cosmere, on every planet, and it's incredibly dangerous. Hemalurgy is the art of stealing power. Here's how it works. You take a metal spike and drive it through a person's heart, or another specific point on their body, killing them. The spike becomes charged with a piece of that person's spiritual aspect, their power, their abilities, their very essence. Then you take that spike and drive it into another person, and they gain the stolen attribute. You can steal allomantic or ferrochemical abilities this way on Scadrial. You can steal radiant powers on Roshar. You can steal physical strength, mental capacity, or other attributes anywhere. Hemalurgy rips pieces of a person's soul and transfers them. But here's why it's so dangerous. First, it requires murder. You have to kill someone to create a hemalurgic spike. This is not a clean or ethical magic system. It's powered by death. Second, using hemalurgic spikes opens you up to corruption and external influence. The spikes create holes in your spiritual aspect, weaknesses that can be exploited by shards or other powerful entities. On Scadrial, Ruin could control anyone with enough hemalurgic spikes in their body. Third, Hemalurgy is lossy. When you steal an ability with a spike, you don't get the full power. A significant portion is lost in the transfer. So, to gain the equivalent of one Allomancer's power, you might need to kill multiple Allomancers and use multiple spikes. Despite these drawbacks, Hemalurgy is attractive to those seeking power because it's universal and because it can grant abilities that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. If you're not born with a magic system, Hemalurgy can give you one. If you want to combine multiple types of powers, Hemalurgy can do that. Hemalurgy appears in various forms throughout the Cosmere. On Scadrial, it was used to create Koloss and Kandra, creatures modified with hemalurgic spikes. Organizations and individuals seeking to accumulate power across multiple worlds have experimented with Hemalurgy. And because it works anywhere, it's one of the few magic systems that's truly Cosmere-wide in its application. There are defenses against Hemalurgy. Aluminum, one of the god metals, can block hemalurgic spikes. Certain forms of investiture can heal the spiritual damage caused by spikes. But Hemalurgy remains one of the most dangerous forces in the Cosmere because it can grant godlike power to mortals
if they're willing to pay the price in lives. The Shattered Plains and the Oathpact. Now let's shift from general Cosmere mechanics to a specific world, Roshar, from the Stormlight Archive. This will help illustrate how Cosmere principles manifest in actual stories. Roshar is a planet dominated by high storms, massive, continent-spanning hurricanes that travel from east to west on a regular schedule. These storms are so powerful that all life on Roshar has adapted to them. Plants retract into stone shells. Animals have carapaces. Cities are built with storm-resistant architecture. The high storms are more than just weather. They're manifestations of Honor's power, carrying stormlight, the form Investiture takes on Roshar. Every high storm recharges spheres, the currency on Roshar that glows with stormlight, and the storms create the temporary perpendicularities that allow access to the cognitive realm. Roshar's history is defined by conflict between humans and a race called the Singers, or Listeners. Thousands of years ago there was a war. Humans were actually refugees from another world, fleeing the destruction of their own planet, and they invaded Roshar with Honor's help. The Singers were the original inhabitants, bonded to Spren and wielding surges, magical powers. This conflict raged until a group of humans bonded with powerful Spren called the Heralds and made a pact, the Oathpact, to contain the enemy. The Oathpact was an agreement between the Heralds and Honor. The Heralds would bear the burden of fighting the Voidbringers, the enemies of mankind, in repeated desolations, apocalyptic wars that threatened to destroy all of Roshar. After each desolation, the Heralds would die and be sent to damnation, a place of eternal torture to hold back the enemy. But eventually, they would break and return, and a new desolation would begin. This cycle continued for thousands of years, with the Heralds dying and being tortured, breaking and returning, over and over. It was an enormous sacrifice, and it slowly destroyed them. Eventually, after what they thought was the last desolation, the Heralds broke the Oathpact. They couldn't endure anymore. They abandoned their duty. This created a period of peace on Roshar that lasted for thousands of years. Civilization rebuilt. The Knights Radiant, warriors bonded to Spren, protected the people. But then something went wrong. The Radiants turned on their oaths and abandoned their powers in an event called the Recreance. And now, in the current era of the Stormlight Archive, the desolations are returning. The enemy is coming back, and Roshar is not prepared. Understanding the Oathpact, the Heralds, and the history of desolations is crucial to understanding the stakes in the Stormlight Archive. This isn't just a war between nations. It's a resumption of an ancient conflict, with the fate of all life on Roshar hanging in the balance. The Knights Radiant and Nahel bonds. One of the most beloved magic systems in the Cosmere is the Knights Radiant system from the Stormlight Archive. Let's talk about how it works and why it matters. The Knights Radiant were an order of warriors who bonded with Spren to gain magical powers called surges. There were 10 orders of Radiants, each bonding a different type of Spren and gaining access to 2 of the 10 surges. The Windrunners, for example, bonded Honor Spren and could use adhesion and gravitation, allowing them to stick things together and control gravitational forces. Essentially, they could fly and manipulate gravity. The Skybreakers bonded High Spren
and could use division and gravitation, allowing them to destroy and fly. The Light Weavers bonded cryptics and could use illumination and transformation, creating illusions and changing one substance into another. Each order had its own abilities, its own ideals, its own role in society, but they all worked the same way fundamentally. A person would attract a spren by living according to certain principles. The spren would begin following them in the physical realm, and if the person spoke certain oaths, the words of the radiant orders, they would form a Nahel bond with the spren. This bond allowed the radiant to draw in Stormlight and use it to fuel their surges.
The oaths are different for each order, but they all follow a pattern. The first ideal is universal across all orders. Life before death. Strength before weakness. Journey before destination. This is the foundational oath that begins the bond. The subsequent ideals are order-specific and become progressively more personal and difficult. A Windrunner's second ideal is, I will protect those who cannot protect themselves. Simple enough. But later ideals require deeper introspection and often force the Radiant to confront their own failings and limitations. The third ideal might be, I will protect even those I hate, so long as it is right. And the fourth and fifth ideals become even more challenging, requiring the Radiant to embody their order's values completely. The beauty of this system is that power is tied to personal growth. You can't cheat your way to becoming a powerful Radiant. You have to actually live these ideals. You have to grow as a person, overcome your flaws, and commit to principles. The spren judge you. If you betray your oaths, you break the bond and lose your powers. This makes the Radiant Orders fundamentally different from other magic systems. It's not about bloodlines or genetic luck. It's about who you are as a person and who you're trying to become. Anyone can become a Radiant if they live according to the right principles and speak the right oaths. In the current era of the Stormlight Archive, the Radiants have been gone for thousands of years, ever since the Recreants, when they abandoned their oaths. But they're returning. New Radiants are bonding spren and speaking oaths, rediscovering powers that have been lost for millennia. This return of the Radiants is central to the story, because the Desolations are also returning, and Roshar will need the Radiants to survive. Allomancy and the metallic arts. Now let's talk about the magic system from Mistborn, the metallic arts. This is one of the most precisely defined magic systems in fantasy, with clear rules, specific effects, and interesting implications. There are 3 metallic arts: Allomancy, Feruchemy, and Hemalurgy. We already discussed Hemalurgy. Let's focus on the other 2. Allomancy is the art of burning metals to gain powers. An allomancer swallows a flake of metal, usually mixed with liquid, and then burns it internally. While the metal is burning, they can use its power. Different metals grant different abilities. Iron allows you to pull on nearby metals, yanking them toward you, or pulling yourself toward them if they're heavier. Steel allows you to push on metals, propelling them away or launching yourself away from them. Tin enhances your senses, making you see, hear, and feel more acutely. Pewter enhances your physical strength, speed, and durability. Copper hides you from allomantic detection. Bronze allows you to detect other allomancers burning metals.
And there are 10 more metals, each with specific effects related to mental, physical, temporal, or enhancement-based powers. Most allomancers can only burn one metal. They're called mistings. A coin shot can only burn steel. A tin eye can only burn tin, and so on. But rarely someone is born who can burn all 16 metals. They're called Mistborn, and they're incredibly powerful because they can combine abilities in creative ways.
Feruchemy is different. Feruchemists use metals to store attributes rather than gain new powers. A feruchemist wearing a metal piece called a metal mind can store some attribute in it. For example, a pewter metal mind stores physical strength. While storing, the feruchemist becomes weaker, but the pewter fills with strength. Later, they can tap the metal mind to withdraw that stored strength, becoming temporarily stronger than normal. The key to feruchemy is balance. You can only get out what you put in. If you store 10 days of normal strength, you can later access 10 days of strength in a few hours, making you incredibly strong briefly. But you had to spend those 10 days weakened. Different metals store different attributes. Iron stores weight. Steel stores physical speed. Tin stores sensory sensitivity. Zinc stores mental speed. Gold stores health, allowing healing. Electrum stores determination and luck. Each of the 16 metals has an associated attribute. Feruchemists, called keepers, use multiple metal minds to create complex effects. They might store speed in steel, weight in iron, and strength in pewter, then tap all three at once to become a nearly unstoppable force for a brief time. The metallic arts are fascinating because they're so systematic. Sanderson created charts showing how each metal relates to others. Allomancy pulls power from preservation, which is why it can give you more than you put in. Feruchemy is balanced by ruin, which is why it's limited to what you store. And Hemalurgy is purely of ruin, which is why it requires destruction. On Scadrial, these three arts were shaped by the presence of preservation and ruin, and understanding how they work tells you something about those shards' natures.
The Lord Ruler and the Ascension. The history of Scadrial is dominated by one figure, the Lord Ruler, who ruled the planet for 1,000 years as an immortal god-emperor. His story is central to the Mistborn series and illustrates how mortals can interact with shard-level powers. 1,000 years before the first Mistborn book, there was a man named Rashek. He was a terraceman, a member of the feruchemist culture, and he was ambitious. At that time, preservation and ruin were locked in a stalemate. Preservation wanted to protect the world. Ruin wanted to destroy it. They couldn't act directly against each other without breaking their agreement, but they could manipulate mortals. Preservation set up a situation where a hero would ascend, taking up a portion of the shard's power at a place called the Well of Ascension. This hero was supposed to use that power to imprison ruin more securely and save the world. The chosen hero was a man named Alendi. But Rashek, Alendi's servant, killed Alendi at the well and took the power for himself. Rashek ascended, becoming a vessel for a portion of preservation's investiture. For a brief time, he was essentially a god. He had access to infinite power and could reshape reality however he wanted. And what did he do? He tried to fix the world, but he didn't really understand what he was doing. He moved the planet closer to the sun to deal with some problem, then had to add ash to the atmosphere to compensate. He created new species, including mist wraiths that would become Kandra. and creatures called Kolos. He restructured society, placing himself as immortal emperor. And when the power faded, and he was no longer ascended, he used feruchemy and allomancy, both of which he had access to through complex means, to keep himself alive indefinitely. The Lord Ruler's reign lasted 1,000 years and was characterized by oppression, strict social hierarchy, and stagnation. He ruled with absolute power, crushing rebellions, controlling information, and presenting himself as a god. But he wasn't evil, exactly. He genuinely believed he was protecting the world. He knew that ruin was imprisoned, and that if certain things happened, ruin would break free and destroy everything. So he maintained control to prevent that. The problem was, his methods were brutal. He enslaved an entire race, the Scar, forcing them to work in fields and mines, while the nobility lived in luxury. He executed anyone who challenged him. He suppressed knowledge and technology, and eventually his oppression led to rebellion. The original Mistborn trilogy is about overthrowing the Lord Ruler and dealing with the consequences. Because when the Lord Ruler falls, all the problems he was keeping in check come flooding back. The Lord Ruler's story is a cautionary tale about power and responsibility. He had godlike power and wanted to help, but he didn't understand the full picture. He made mistakes that lasted 1,000 years, and his legacy affects Scadrial for generations after his death. This theme repeats throughout the Cosmere. Mortals gaining access to divine power often cause as many problems as they solve, because being powerful doesn't make you wise. The history of Elantris.
Let's shift to another world cell and talk about the history that shapes the book Elantris. Cell is the planet where devotion and dominion invested before being killed by odium. Their death and the splintering of their power created unique magical consequences. On Cell, in the nation of Arelon, there was a city called Elantris. It was a place of magic and wonder, where people chosen by some mysterious process would be transformed into Elantrians. These Elantrians had silver skin, glowing hair, and access to incredible magical powers. They could draw aeons, magical symbols from the aeon language, in the air, and those aeons would produce effects. Draw the aeon for fire, and fire appears. Draw the aeon for healing, and wounds close. The Elantrians were effectively immortal, didn't need to eat, and could accomplish magical feats that seemed miraculous. Elantris was the center of Arelon's power. Elantrians advised kings, built wonders, and protected the nation. Being chosen to become an Elantrian was considered a blessing. Then, 10 years before the book begins, something went wrong. A massive earthquake struck, and the magic broke. New Elantrians still appeared, still transformed, but instead of becoming powerful and glowing, they became cursed. Their skin turned gray and splotchy, their hair fell out. They felt constant pain from any wound, which never healed. They felt constant hunger, which food couldn't satisfy, and they lost access to their powers. Elantris became a city of the damned, where these failed Elantrians were thrown to rot, forgotten by society. This event, called the Riad,
destroyed Aralan's power and plunged the nation into decline. The book Elantris is about discovering what went wrong and how to fix it. And the answer is tied to the splintering of devotion and dominion. The magic on Cell is powered by the door, the combined investiture of the two dead shards trapped in the cognitive realm. Aeons work by tapping into the door and channeling its power. But aeons are tied to geography. They're based on the shape of the land. When the earthquake happened, it changed the landscape just enough that the aeons no longer matched the geography perfectly. The mismatch meant the aeons couldn't properly access the door, and the magic broke. This is what makes Cell's magic unique. It's location-dependent. On Scadrial or Roshar, you can use magic anywhere on the planet. On Cell, magic systems are tied to specific regions, and they require knowledge of specific languages or symbols tied to geography. There are multiple magic systems on Cell, each tied to different regions and different languages. Aeon Door in Aralan, Cheishan in Jindo, Dakor in Fjorden. All of them access the door, but through different cultural and linguistic frameworks. This makes Cell's magic incredibly complex and also incredibly vulnerable. Change the landscape, and you can break the magic. Disrupt the connection to the door, and powers fail. It's a fascinating system, and shows how the death of shards can create unexpected, magical consequences. The Awakeners of Nalthis. Now let's talk about Warbreaker and the magic system of awakening. Nalthis is a world where endowment invested, and the magic system reflects endowment's intent of giving. On Nalthis, everyone is born with one breath, a piece of investiture that represents their life force and soul. You can live a normal life with just your breath, but you can also give your breath to someone else voluntarily, and they can accumulate multiple breaths. The more breaths you have, the more you can sense and perceive, and the more you can do with awakening. Awakening is the art of using breath to animate objects. You speak a command, invest an object with breath, and the object comes to life and follows that command. Awaken a rope with the command to hold, and it will wrap around something and hold tight. Awaken a piece of cloth with the command to protect, and it will move to shield you from attacks. Awaken a corpse with enough breath and a complex command, and you get a lifeless, a zombie-like servant that follows orders. The more breaths you invest into an object, the more sophisticated and intelligent the awakening can be. At certain thresholds of accumulated breath, you gain heightenings, which are levels of power. At the first heightening, you can sense perfect pitch and perceive colors more vividly. At the second heightening, you gain perfect color recognition. At higher heightenings, you gain immunity to disease, slowed aging, and even more exotic abilities. At the 10th heightening, you effectively become immortal and gain the title of Returned. The Returned are unique to Nalthis. When someone dies heroically or in a moment of great significance, endowment can offer them a choice: stay dead or return to life with the power of a Returned. If they accept, they come back with one breath per week sustaining them, which they receive from endowment directly. They have perfect bodies, ethereal beauty, and considerable magical power. Returned are worshipped as gods in the nation of Halandrin, and they form the ruling council. But there's a cost. A Returned must consume one breath per week to stay alive. If they don't have a breath to consume, they die permanently. So returned are dependent on others giving them breath voluntarily, which creates a religious economy where people offer their breath to the gods. The book Warbreaker explores the politics of this system, the ethics of using breath and creating lifeless, and the discovery that the returned aren't actually gods, they're just people, given power by endowment. One of the main characters, Vasher, is a man with enough breath to have achieved the 5th heightening, making him extremely powerful. Another character, Vivenna, begins with just her single breath, and must navigate a world where breath equals power and status. The magic system is elegant and thematically rich. It's about giving and taking, about the value of life force, about what people will sacrifice for power. And like all Cosmere magic, it has clear rules and interesting implications. You can only give breath voluntarily. It can't be stolen, except through Hemalurgy. Objects that are awakened act according to their commands, but have limited intelligence. And the more human-like the object, the better it holds awakening. Cloth awakens better than stone. Organic material awakens better than metal. And corpses, because they were once alive, are the easiest to awaken into lifeless servants, though that practice is considered deeply disturbing by many cultures on Nalthis. Hoid, the wanderer between worlds. We need to talk about the most important character in the Cosmere, even though he's never the main protagonist of any book. His name is Hoid, though he uses dozens of aliases. In the Stormlight Archive, he's known as Wit, the King's Jester. In Mistborn, he appears as an informant and storyteller. In Warbreaker, he's a storyteller and beggar. In Elantris, he's barely visible, just a background character. But he's always there, always manipulating events from the shadows, always working towards some mysterious goal. Hoid is ancient. He was alive before the Shattering of Adonalsium. He was present at the Shattering, and chose not to take up a shard, though he had the opportunity. He's been world-hopping for thousands of years, visiting every planet in the Cosmere, collecting magic systems and artifacts, and interfering in major events. And we still don't fully understand what he wants, or why he does what he does. Hoid has access to multiple magic systems. He's an Allomancer, holding Lerasium, a god metal that can grant Allomancy. He holds hundreds of breaths from Nalthis, giving him high heightenings. He's bonded with a cryptic spren on Roshar, making him a light weaver. He has other powers and abilities that we haven't fully seen yet. This makes him incredibly versatile and difficult to kill or stop. Hoid is characterized by his wit, his cryptic advice, and his tendency to tell stories that contain deeper truths. He often appears to main characters at crucial moments and gives them information or perspective that helps them make important decisions. But he never explains his own motives clearly. He speaks in riddles, tells parable-like stories, and vanishes when pressed for direct answers. The community of Cosmere readers has spent years trying to understand Hoid. What is his goal? Some theories suggest he's trying to reunite the Shards, to recreate Adonalsium. Others think he's trying to stop Odium from destroying everything. Still others believe he has a personal agenda that has nothing to do with the Shards at all. Sanderson has confirmed that Hoid's story will eventually be told in a series called Dragonsteel, which will be set in the past and explain who Hoid was before the Shattering and why he made the choices he made. Until then, Hoid remains one of the great mysteries of the Cosmere. What we do know is that recognizing Hoid in different books is a treat for fans. He's a constant thread running through all the stories, a reminder that everything is connected. And when Hoid shows up and tells a character a story, it's worth paying attention, because that story usually contains clues about Cosmere-wide plot threads.
The Southern Scadrians and the Future. Let's talk about where the Cosmere is heading. Sanderson has a plan for multiple eras of Cosmere stories. We're currently in what fans call the First Era for most worlds. Mistborn is ahead, already in its Second Era with the Wax and Wane books, and planning for Third and Fourth Eras. The Stormlight Archive is planned as 2 5-book series, with a time jump between them. And beyond that, Sanderson has plans for a space-age Cosmere, where the planets have developed space travel and are interacting directly. The Mistborn Third Era books will be set in a 1980s level of technology, with computers, firearms, and possibly early space technology. The Fourth Era will be full science fiction, with space travel, laser weapons, and interplanetary conflict. Characters from different planets will meet in space. Magic will be studied scientifically on a Cosmere-wide scale. The Shards' plans and conflicts will come to a head. This future era of the Cosmere is decades away in real time, but it's already being set up in the current books. References to Southern Scadrians, who have technology more advanced than the North. Hints about the development of aluminum technology, which blocks Investiture and will be crucial for space travel. Worldhoppers, establishing trade networks between planets. There's also a planned trilogy called Mistborn: The Lost Metal Era, which bridges the gap between current Mistborn and the Space Age, and a series called Nightblood, which will follow characters from Warbreaker in later time periods. Sanderson has said that the ultimate endpoint of the Cosmere story involves a confrontation with Odium and a resolution to the Shard conflicts that have been brewing since the Shattering. Characters from all the different series will come together. The secrets of Investiture will be fully revealed, and the fate of the entire Cosmere will be decided. This long-term planning is part of what makes the Cosmere special. Sanderson isn't just writing books. He's constructing a multi-generational story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. He knows how it will conclude, and he's planting seeds now that won't pay off until books published 20 or 30 years from now. For readers who stay with the series, who read every book and piece together every clue, the payoff will be enormous. Connection and identity in the Cosmere. Before we close out this introduction, we need to talk about 2 concepts that are crucial throughout the Cosmere: connection and identity. These are spiritual attributes, parts of a person's existence in the spiritual realm that affect how they interact with Investiture and the world. Connection is exactly what it sounds like. It's your relationships and ties. You have connection to your homeland, to your language, to your culture. You have connection to people you love, to gods you worship, to organizations you belong to. Connection is what binds things together in the spiritual realm. When you use magic tied to a specific location, like on Cell, you need connection to that location for the magic to work properly. When a shard grants you power, you have connection to that shard. Connection can be strengthened, weakened, or severed. Hemalurgy can steal connection.
Certain metals can store connection in ferrochemy. Understanding and manipulating connection is key to advanced use of investiture. Identity is who you are at a fundamental level. It's not just your personality or your memories. It's your spiritual sense of self. Identity determines which magic systems you can naturally access. If your identity is tied to Scadrial, you might be able to become an Allomancer. If your identity is tied to Roshar, you might be able to bond a Spren. Identity also determines how you appear in the cognitive realm and how you interact with investiture on a deep level. Both connection and identity can be manipulated by those who know how. You can use ferrochemy to store identity, making yourself a blank slate that can pick up different magic systems. You can form connections to new places or shards through intentional effort. Worldhoppers often manipulate their connection and identity to better integrate into new worlds, or to gain access to multiple magic systems. There are also ways to hide identity or connection, making yourself harder to track or target with magic. The god metal aluminum naturally disrupts investiture and can block connection. Understanding these concepts is important because they explain how some of the more esoteric Cosmere magic works. Why can some people use multiple magic systems? Because they've altered their identity or formed connections to multiple shards. How do Worldhoppers navigate the cognitive realm? By understanding connection and using it to anchor themselves and find their destinations. Why do some magical effects work on some people but not others? Because of differences in identity and connection. These aren't just abstract philosophical concepts. They're fundamental forces in the Cosmere, as important as physical laws, and characters who understand them have significant advantages over those who don't. The Cosmere community and Easter eggs. One of the best parts of the Cosmere is the community of readers who analyze every detail, piece together clues, and share theories. Sanderson actively engages with this community, answering questions and occasionally confirming or denying theories. There's a fan-maintained wiki called The Coppermind that documents everything we know about the Cosmere. There are forums and subreddits where readers discuss the latest revelations. There are YouTube channels dedicated to Cosmere theory crafting, and Sanderson himself participates, doing regular Q&A sessions and even releasing side content that expands on Cosmere lore. Sanderson plants Easter eggs throughout his books, references to other series, Worldhoppers making appearances, mentions of events that happened on other planets. Finding these Easter eggs is a game for fans. When you read a Stormlight book and notice a description that matches a character from Mistborn, you know a Worldhopper just walked by. When you read about a metal that doesn't exist on the planet you're currently reading about, you know it's from somewhere else. These Easter eggs don't affect the main plot. You can completely miss them and still enjoy the story. But for readers who are paying attention, they add an extra layer of depth and interconnection. They're reminders that every book is part of a larger whole. Sanderson has also been transparent about his plans. He publishes his progress on his website, showing which books he's working on and how far along they are. He does annual State of the Sanderson posts, explaining what's coming next. He's even released unpublished early novels online for fans to read, books that aren't canon, but show how he developed the Cosmere concept. This transparency and engagement with fans creates a unique relationship between author and audience. Readers feel like they're part of the journey, not just passive consumers. And Sanderson uses feedback from the community to refine details.
though he doesn't change major plot points based on theories. If fans guess a twist, he doesn't change it just to surprise them. He trusts that the journey and execution are more important than pure surprise. This approach has built one of the most dedicated fantasy fandoms in existence. The Cosmere community is enthusiastic, welcoming to new readers, and deeply invested in the ongoing story.
Where to start and what to read? If you're new to the Cosmere and wondering where to start, the good news is you have options. You don't have to read the books in publication order. You don't have to read every book. You can start wherever seems interesting to you. Most people start with either Mistborn, The Final Empire, or The Way of Kings. Mistborn is shorter, more focused, and has a complete trilogy that tells a satisfying story. It's a good introduction to how Sanderson writes and how Cosmere magic works. The Way of Kings is longer and more complex, but it's the beginning of Sanderson's most ambitious series. If you want to dive into the deep end, start there. Warbreaker is a good standalone that sets up some things relevant to Stormlight Archive. So some people read it before Way of Kings. Elantris is also a standalone, though it's one of Sanderson's earlier books and doesn't quite have the polish of his later work. Still worth reading, especially if you're interested in the history of the Cosmere. The novellas and shorter works, like The Emperor's Soul or Edge Dancer, are great palate cleansers between larger books. They're tightly written, focused stories that often explore corners of the Cosmere that don't get as much attention in the main series. Reading order is flexible, but there are a few recommendations. If you're going to read Stormlight Archive, read Warbreaker first. Not required, but recommended. If you're reading Mistborn Era 2, read the original trilogy first. Era 2 assumes you know the history of Scadrial. Beyond that, read in whatever order interests you. The books are designed to stand alone. You won't be lost. But as you read more, you'll start seeing the connections, recognizing the Worldhoppers, understanding the references. And that's when the Cosmere really opens up. The important thing is to start somewhere and enjoy the journey. The Cosmere is a massive, interconnected universe, with more content than most people can read in a year. Take your time. Read what interests you. And know that every book you read is adding to your understanding of a much larger story. Closing thoughts. We've covered a lot in this introduction. The three realms: physical, cognitive, and spiritual. Investiture, the universal magical energy. The shattering of Adonalsium and the 16 Shards. The different planets and their unique magic systems. Worldhoppers, Hemalurgy, connection and identity. The long-term plans for a space-age Cosmere. The community of readers piecing together clues. This is the Cosmere, a dwarf galaxy filled with magic, gods who are flawed and mortal in their own ways, and characters making choices that ripple across worlds and ages. It's a setting where magic has rules, where power comes with costs, where knowledge and understanding are as important as strength. Brandon Sanderson has created something remarkable here, a fantasy universe that respects its readers' intelligence, that rewards careful attention, that tells both intimate character stories and cosmic-scale conflicts. Whether you're here to fall asleep to fantasy lore or to learn everything about this universe, I hope this introduction has given you a foundation to build on. The Cosmere is still being written.
There are decades of books ahead, stories we haven't seen yet, secrets we don't know. But that's part of the magic. We get to experience this universe as it unfolds, book by book, discovery by discovery. So whether you're about to pick up your first Cosmere novel, or you've read them all and wanted a refresher, welcome. Welcome to a universe where magic is science, where gods can die, where heroes rise from the most unlikely places. Welcome to the Cosmere. Thank you for listening. Whether this helped you fall asleep or taught you something new, I hope it served its purpose. Rest well, or read well, whichever you need. This has been an introduction to the Cosmere, Brandon Sanderson's interconnected universe of magic and wonder.